With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Lamed Ches. We began the sugya on Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. Firstly, the Mishnah tells us that Habehema v'Hakelim Keragli Haba'olim. In other words, just like a person is bound by the 2,000 Amma Tchum boundary, beyond which one may not walk, not on Shabbos, not on Yom Tiv. Similarly, a person's animals, a person's items also may not be taken beyond the owner's tchum. That's number one. Then we learned in the Mishnah that if there are two partners that own something together, and each one has a different tchum, that will limit the area where this item, where their jointly owned items may go to. It can only go to an area that is common to both of them. Then the Mishnah said at the end that if a woman is making a dough, that was the example the Mishnah gave, and she needs to borrow from her neighbor salt, spices, or water, Tanach also water, being that even though it was lent to the dough maker on Yom Tiv, now it's hers, right? But since when Yom Tov came in, it belonged to the neighbor. So now the baked bread, and really, as we'll see, a cooked pot similarly, may only be taken to an area that's common to both of them, because the flour belongs to the person who made it. Some of the ingredients belonged when Yom Tov came in to the neighbor. If they don't share the same tchum, that limits the area where the bread can go. We learned on Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis regarding the barrel. Let's focus only on the case of a barrel that belongs to two partners, and they divided the partnership up during Yom Tov. So there was a machlekes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav, as the Gemara explains, subscribes to the principle of Bereida. Bereida means retroactive clarification. When they divided the partnership with Rav, it means that retroactively, the half that was received by Reuven was always Reuven's. The half that now was Shimon's was always Shimon's. So now each one is not bound by their partner's tchum. Shmuel, who does not subscribe to the principle of Bereida, and the key factor is, who did it belong to when Yom Tov came in? Since then, it belonged to two different people. If they had different tchumen, then yes, this item, this barrel, according to Shmuel, is restricted to the area that's only common to both of them. That is where we left off. Now, concerning this question of Bereida, the Gemara began with the version that Rabbi Oishia says, Yesh Bereida, Rabbi Yechanan says, Ein Bereida. And the Gemara challenged that version. Rabbi Yoshua ascribes to Bereida. We have a Mishnah in Ahalais. We don't have to repeat it. We already had it twice in this Masechta, yesterday and earlier on. The sugya is called Soif Tuma Lotzes. The din that if a person, a corpse of a Yid is in a room, it gives off Tumas oil, not only to everything that's under the roof in that room, but if there's doorways, even if the door is closed, items that are on the other side of the door, but still in the doorway, also will acquire tuma only if the mace is going to go through that doorway. And when we spoke about the person determining through which doorway he'll take out the mace when there are many options, Rabbi Oishia was the one that says that determination only affects Mikan Ulahaba, only from here on and not retroactively, which is a proof that Rabbi Oishia does not subscribe to Bereida. Because if you subscribe to retroactive clarification, then that determination should also affect items that were under that doorway prior to that determination. And we left off yesterday that indeed we have to therefore flip the version that Rabbi Oishia holds Ein Bereida and Rabbi Yechanan holds that Yesh Bereida. Now we're going to still have some back and forth, and ultimately we're going to go back to the original version. Rabbi Oishia subscribes to Bereida. Rabbi Yechanan says Ein Bereida. However, we will actually speak out that which we paskin, that the Poel Mamish, when it comes to any Torah, biblical related halacha, we say Ein Bereida. When it comes to rabbinic laws, like Tchumen, which is a rabbinic law, we say Yesh Bereida, and therefore the halacha will be like Rav, which is normally the halacha. When it comes to Dinei Isuri, Rav Shmuel, halachic Rav, that the chavius of the partners, after they divide it, will be mutter. Each one can take it to the area where they are allowed to go, even if it's beyond the tchum of their original partner. Now, the rest of the daf will be a fascinating discussion regarding the last din in the Mishnah that we just reviewed, that a woman is making a dough, can be a man, someone is making bread, they need some ingredients, The example the Mishnah gave was salt, was spices. I don't want to mention water because by water there's the machlokas tanoim. Salt and spices. So says the Mishnah, now that you have a product, bread has some ingredients from the dough maker, from the bread maker. Some ingredients that was in the possession of the neighbor in the beginning of Yom Tov. The bread is also bound to the tchum that's only common to both of them. The Gemara asks a simple question. Why don't we apply the rule of bittul? How many times in Torah do we have the concept that something that's in the minority is nullified in the majority? You're speaking about spices, you're speaking about salt. It's very small. The flour is a lot. Why don't we apply the concept of nullification bittul, thus allowing the bread to be taken to the tchum of the person who owned the flour, not restricting it to the tchum of the original owner of the salt and of the spices? That was the question, and there's going to be a fascinating back and forth whether we say bittul only by dinei isurim. Do we also say bittul by dinei mamayna? One can argue bittul is only for legal halachic isser v'heter laws, but when it comes to financial matters, indeed, we don't say bittul. We're going to have the difference even by dinei de mamayna. There might be a difference between money sheyesh loy tovim. If the property has a claimant, it's more significant, not batel, even beroiv, and no matter what number, versus perhaps if you have sometimes that something has an owner, but the owner finds that item so insignificant, the owner has no proprietary interest, she'ein loy tovim, that perhaps will be batel. And ultimately, the Gemara is going to give, and well, God willing, we'll get there, 3 explanations why in our Mishnah, the original owner of the salt and of the pepper and of the spices, their ownership is not going to be nullified. And therefore, like the Mishnah says, the product, the bread or the cooked pot will be bound, will be limited to the tchum of both the ones who gave the flour or gave the meat, and also to the ones who owned at the beginning of Yom Tov the spices and a lot more. Let us start on Aflam and Zayin Amid Beis, 5 lines before the bottom of the Amid. So again, because of the Mishnah in Ahalois regarding Soifoi, Tumalatzes, where Rabbi Oishia clearly says something which implies that he does not accept Breda, so it must be that Rabbi Oishia paskins in the question, do we say Breda, do we not say Breda? Rabbi Oishia says Ein Breda, and Rabbi Yechanan says Yesh Breda, and the Gemara is going to say that will not work as well. 5 lines before the bottom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nivudvar. Me is like Rabbi Yechanan Breda, but Rabbi Yechanan also doesn't subscribe to Breda. Yaakov Avinu passes away, the patriarch passes away, he leaves an estate, and he has various sons. Prior to their dividing it, that estate is called halachically the tfisas habayis. Let's say that more or less the children own it jointly. If later they make a division, there are 2 ways of looking at this division. Way number 1 is that now that each one got their house, we view it as if they retroactively, they got it directly from the father. Breda. Another way of looking at it is as no, that when the father passed away, since he left more than 1 child, so there was a period where they were partners, and now it means each one owned a little bit of everything. And now that it was determined that this house goes to Reuven and that house goes to Shimon, they exchange it with each other. It's as if they bought it and sold it with each other. And that will have a huge consequence. The consequence will be that during the time that Yovel was in act, every year of Yovel, everything reverted back to the original owners. And says Rabbi Yechanan that when brothers divide, because he does not subscribe to Breda, we don't say that it's as if the brothers got it directly from their father. No, their division was only after they chose to divide it. Prior to that, they owned everything together. So the act of the division is like a sale or an exchange. And therefore, they have the law of anyone who got property through an act of a sale or through an exchange, that the entire division reverts back to joint ownership every 50th year, and they have to make another division. If Rabbi Yechanan would have subscribed to Breda, he would not have said that. Because once the brothers chose to divide the estate the way they chose it, let's say that that's retroactive, what each one got directly from the father. If that's what they got directly from the father, that should never revert in the year of Yovel. And maybe, let's Gemara now finally brings up this topic, that let's keep with this altered version. But when does Rabbi Yochanan not subscribe to Bereda? Only by the Oiraisa. Yerusha is a biblical law. It doesn't go retroactive. The father dies, they're partners. Now when they divide, the division is only Mikan Ulahabo. It's an exchange. It's like selling. I sold my part of mine to you, your part to me. That's why he says it reverts back in Yovel. But with the Rabbanan, then Islay, right? Then let's say Dinei Tchumen, which is the case of the Chavis, because the Tchum is the Rabbanan. The Gemara says, "Nanat mit Rabbi Yochanan." Ube the Rabbanan mi Islay, even by Dinei the Rabbanan, Rabbi Yochanan does not subscribe to the principle of Bereda. Where do we see that? V'chotani ayoy taught the following brayso, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein adam masnal shnei devarim ke'echad. When we speak about placing a tchum, I can only place a tchum in one location. Like we spoke out a little bit yesterday in the intro, as we learn a lot of Masechtas Eruvin, no one has more than the tchum. The only question is, from where do you begin measuring it? So if I want to go to a city to the right, and I put the tchum to the right, then it extends my boundary to the right, but it diminishes my boundary to the left. And same thing, vice versa. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that if you have today's Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov, and I have a city to my right and a city to my left, they're both beyond the tchum, 3,000 amas to the right, 3,000 amas to the left. I have to choose before Yom Tov, before Shabbos, which village I want to go to. The only thing you can do is you have to pick which one you want to go to. However, but if there's something attractive tomorrow, both to the village to the right and to the village to the left, I cannot put 2 Eruvin out of Shabbos and say, tomorrow I'll determine which one I want to go to. That you can't do. Obviously, if you would subscribe to Bereda, you would be allowed to do that as well. Oh, and so the question is, what about the first case of Rabbi Yehuda that everyone agrees to? And that is that if I don't know which village the Chacham is coming to the right or to the left, I can place 2 Eruvim, and then I could, by discovering where the Chacham is going, I could rely on that Eruv. Why? Also Bereda. The line, the Ein Bereda, second line. So Mizrachu might have Nama Ein Bereda. Why would one be allowed to put an Eruv in both directions and saying that when I'll find out tomorrow which place will the speaker come to, I'll go to that city. That's also Bereda. And V'Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan obviously is explaining it because so he understands. Ukvar b'chacham. Indeed, we never say Bereda, not even by Tchumen, which is the Rabbanan. However, if the speaker already arrived in the village before Shabbos or before Yom Tov, it's only that I don't know which side it is. Did he come to the village in the Mizrach? Did he come to the village in the Ma'ariv? That's not Bereda. Then I can put 2 Eruvin, and I can say when I'll discover which village the Chacham is already in, that's the one that's going to function. That you can do, because you're not going retroactive. The Chacham is already there. But if the Chacham didn't yet come, and the Chacham might go to the Mizrach or might go to the Ma'ariv, then indeed I cannot put 2 Eruvim and stipulate to whichever one he'll end up going, that's where I'll go, because Rabbi Yochanan, even though he's explaining Rabbi Yehuda, he also does not hold of Bereda, not even by the Rabbanan. Alma leis le Rabbi Yochanan Bereda, and therefore the Gemara says La'olam lo tepuch, going back to the original version, that Rabbi Oishia was the one that said Yesh Bereda. That's the way it is. If Rabbi Oishia says Yesh Bereda, what about the halacha by Ahalois Soifei Tumalotzes? The Chileis le Rabbi Oishia Bereda. By the case of the Ahalois, that's taka because it's a bid d'oraisa. And like we mentioned yesterday, that this rule that Tuma goes through the doorway, even if the door is closed, to anything that's on the other side of the door, under the doorway, that's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, meaning that's a d'oraisa. And that's why his determination through which doorway will the mace be taken out only has a koyach mikan ulahaba. Aval b'derabanan, which is the case of the chavis, the case of tchumen, Rabbi Oishia will subscribe to Bereira. What's Rabbi Yechanan never subscribes to Bereira. Rabbi Oishia subscribes to Bereira by Dinei Derabanan, and indeed Darash Mazutra that the halacha is like Rabbi Oishia. I just want to point out that sometimes it's spelled with a hey and it's pronounced more Hoshaya, but you see it's the same one. Sometimes it's spelled with an aleph. Rabbi Oishia. Okay, and by the way, that's the way we pass. Now, a little bit more about the general principle of the Mishnah, that the tchum of an object will be dependent on who was in control over it when Shabbos or Yom Tov came in. We already learned in the Mishnah, you don't have to mamash own it, but you have to be in control over it. Now we're going to learn a few exceptions. Amar Shmuel, shiur shel patam. A patam is a professional who fattens animals for sale. And as we already learned, that animals could be bought on Yom Tov with all of the restrictions. A patam does not want to have a single animal in his possession. You're a merchant. You want to sell your merchandise. That means that from the outset of Yom Tov, the patam was hoping that someone will pick up his animals during Yom Tov. You know what the din is? Being that tchumen is midrabanan, whether we're going to follow, some Rishonim learn it's because of Bereira. Some people understand you don't even need Bereira. Harehu keragle shall call Adam. That's a very big chiddush. In other words, anyone who's going to end up buying this animal on Yom Tov, even if you live in another city, we're going to say that shiur is bound to the purchaser's tchum and not to the patam's tchum. Look inside the second line in Rashi under the Gemara. The kiven the oirche lezabune, since he normally sells his merchandise, may esmoil oikme bereshusai, he already put it in the mind of the one who will buy it. If I'm not mistaken, Rashi is trying to emphasize you don't even need Bereira here. A merchant can say that I was not in control of it. Of course, I was in control of it, but I already wanted it to go to the hands of the purchasers, and it's only going to be bound by the tchum of the purchaser. Something similar, not exactly the same, is animals that are with the shepherd. You see, shepherds don't fatten their animals. There's nothing unique about it. People from other villages don't come to the shepherd of this village, but people that live in the same village of the roya, of the shepherd, they end up buying it from the shepherd. We're speaking about everything is kosher. The shepherd who also sells animals. So even though it's not mamish keragle shall call Adam, again, because if someone from another village happened to come and buy it from the roya, he won't be allowed to take it to the new tchum of the purchaser because he came from someplace else, but from at least people in that city, harehu keragle shall oisa ha'ir, meaning that if the shepherd placed his own tchum somewhere, the animals that he ends up selling is not bound by the tchum of the roya, even though the roya was in control of the animal when Yom Tov came in. Because like Rashi says the words, since he was hoping and he was wanting for someone to buy those animals that he sells from him, he already gave it over to whoever the purchaser will be. And being that they normally only come from the city, so that only goes to people who come in the city. Okay. Now, the Mishnah said, that was the key. That if a person borrows a utensil, borrowing means they have to give it back. They have to give this back. Unlike borrowing food, that's different. Like in the last case in the Mishnah, when I borrow your salt, I'm not going to give you back this salt. But when you borrow a keli, you're going to give back the keli. It really belongs to the lender, to the mashal, but it's not about halachic ownership. It's about who's in control over it. And the borrower is in control over it. The borrower is actually considered the owner. By the way, a borrower has to pay even if there's an oinus, he's chayiv. Why is he chayiv? Because he's like the owner. If I'm the owner and an oinus happens, it's my loss. Okay. Mar says pshita. The chiddush here will be that even in a case even where the borrower de facto only received it on Yom Tov. In other words, you the lender already committed to lend it to me prior to Yom Tov. That needs to happen. But even if I only got it b'poil on Yom Tov, one would think that since when Yom Tov came in, and that's the key, where was it, under whose control was it when Yom Tov came in? Lav b'rishusei oitmei, it wasn't yet in the hands of the borrower. Kumash malan, Very, as we just had from Shmuel, that the mashil already knew he's going to lend it. So in his mind, he already gave it over. So therefore, it's bound only by the recipient's tchum. And indeed, that if I borrow your utensil, we came to an understanding before Yom Tov. Because the mashal was already intending to give it to the shoyl. The next case in the Mishnah was that if Yom Tov, if I only asked for it and received it on Yom Tov, even though now it's in my possession, I'm the borrower, you're the lender. But when Yom Tov came in, when Shabbos came in, it was under the control of the lender. So keraglei hamashal, it remains bound exclusively to the tchum of the lender. Here again, pshita. So the Gemara says no, daloi. It's needed. The ragel v'shoel minei, the borrower is someone who constantly borrows this item from the lender. I always borrow your pot. It's almost as if it's known that I will borrow your pot. So again, like we just had from Shmuel. In other words, the lender mistama knew, this my neighbor is for sure going to borrow the kelim, and he always gave it. We don't say that. Komash Malan, that Neymar Omar, that maybe the lender thought maybe the borrower will find someone else to borrow stuff from. He wasn't convinced, he wasn't certain if they did not already agree that indeed that item will be loaned to the borrower, and therefore he's not a merchant. He doesn't benefit by the merchant wants to sell items. The lender doesn't lavdafka wants to lend it. He's a nice person. She's a nice person. But since it was not loaned and not spoken about, it remains bound to the boundary of the lender. And now the final
Rabbi,
case. Yes.
Quick question. How is it different from the first case? We said the first case, he asked from it before Yom Tif, and he got it on Yom Tif.
That's the difference.
But here also we're saying
no,
he asked it before he got on Yom Tif.
No, I didn't ask from it. But let's say, Tzvika, you always lend me your pot. You always lend me your pot, but I never said, Tzvika, I'm going to need your pot on Yom Tif. That's the difference. So we don't say that since I always have borrowed from you, so it's as if you knew I'm going to borrow it. No. If I didn't ask it from you until when I ask it from you, you don't know for sure if I'm going to ask it from you. Maybe I'll find someone else to borrow it from. Okay. Final case in the Mishnah, guys. This sugya is such a yesodis dika sugya, what we are about to learn. That if a woman borrowed from her friend, now the Mishnah, just to make it clear, the Mishnah spoke about making a dough, and as we will see, it's a dough and making a pot of food. All right. And what did she buy? The Mishnah gave 3 examples: spices, water, salt. Now, this type of borrowing is a little bit different, just to make that clear. Because if I'm making food and you lend to me pepper, you don't expect that pepper back. I owe you another pepper. I'll give you pepper. I'll give you salt back. So the Mishnah says, well, since when Yom Tov came in, the pepper, the salt belonged to the neighbor. The flour belongs to the bread maker. Now they're mixed together. So now it's an item that's bound to the tchum that's only good for both of them, to the common area. That was what the Mishnah said. Okay. So says the Gemara that Kisolik Rebbe Abba, when Rab Abba went to Eretz Yisrael, Amar, he said the following prayer. He davened, Yehei Rava, may it be Hashem's will. The Ema Milsa Teskabel, that when I will go to Eretz Yisrael, and he knew that he's going to find the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, and there's going to be a interaction with Torah, that the words that I say should find favor in the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael. He made that Tefilla, and as we will see, that Tefilla was ineffective. Kisalik, when he went to Eretz Yisrael. So Ashkeche, he found, now we have different versions, okay? Either L'Rab Ovin, that's the gears of the Marshal, or we have here to Rabbi Yechanan and Rab Chanina Bar Papi, the Rab Zera. Other people say that he encountered the Rabbi Bohu, Rab Shimon ben Pazi, the Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. So he found a group of Amoraim from Eretz Yisrael. And he heard them learning our Mishnah, and they asked, why? Meaning, the liftil mayim umelach legabe Isa. We have throughout Torah the concept of nullification. Let's use the word bittul, speaking about a very insignificant amount, quantitatively. salt or pepper or water, versus the flour. The flour is a lot more voluminous. There's a lot more of it. So why don't we apply the concept of bittul, meaning that the tchum of the bread should only be the tchum of the flour owner? Why is it also bound by the original salt owner? Bittul. So Amar Lahu Rab Abba. So Rab Abba heard this question, so he now introduced himself by responding, Daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis. This is a very important Amid. And he gave the following analogy. Let me just say by heart, Le Rashi. We're learning Gemara Rashi. What he told them was that you cannot compare Dinei Isura and Dina de Mamoina. By Dinei Isura, you have bittul. By Dina de Mamoina, there's no bittul. And he gave the following example. And then we're going to nitpick apart his example. Excuse me. Hareshin is sort of like kav chitin. Let's say Reuven owns 1 kav of wheat, and it got mixed up in 10 kavim of Shimon's wheat. Shal chavere. If you would say bittul, what would that mean? Would it mean that Shimon can eat up all the 11 kav without needing to compensate Reuven? But Yoichel Halal, can Shimon eat it v'chadi and just be happy? Bittul? Of course not. In other words, by Dina Isura, yes, we say bittul. Kosher and treif, we say bittul. Whether you need to have roiv, whether you need to have shishim, whether you need to have meya, whether you need nosayim, there's bittul when there is bittul. But by finances, you don't say bittul. And therefore, where does tchum come from? Tchum is connected to ownership. I know it doesn't have to mean you own it. It has to be under your control. But let's use the word ownership is a financial, is a dina de mamoina. It's a monetary law. So therefore, since the tavlin belongs to the neighbor, they own it. They owned it. They owned it when Yom Tov came in. So if the ownership was the neighbors, so in consequence, the tchum is still bound to the neighbors. Right? It makes a lot of sense. Sounds great. Ooh, wow, did they rip it apart? So you know what they did? Achiku alei. They laughed at him. What a response. Laughing at someone means that what you're saying is so not good. I don't even have to explain why it's not good. And he didn't understand. So Amar Lahu, so he responded that Gulsaichu Shakli, did I take your tunics? That what? That you're laughing at me? No, it's that I do something funny? And instead of them explaining, they laughed at him more. And now we're going to have a discussion in the Gemara. So first of all, there's so much to learn from over here. Don't daven. There are certain things that you have to daven for, and certain things davening that your Torah should be accepted. Make sure your Torah is good. Number one, and number two, you don't need for your Torah to be accepted. Share your Torah. Let your Torah not be accepted. We want the emes. Okay, and more, but let's leave it at that. And now it's amazing. So now the Gemara is going to quote different Amoraim that we're explaining, and there's going to be people defending Reb Abba and people defending the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael. Who is right? Is the answer correct or is the answer not? Now, if the answer is not correct, then we'll have to get the answer. So let's begin. So Amar Rab Oishia, he's defending the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael. Shapir Ovid the Achichu alei. It's good that they laughed at him, because let's analyze Rab Abba himself. He had a very simple question. Guys, I want to make 2 points. Number one, number two. Number one, when it comes to all dinei bittul, let's remember, there is a difference between min b'minoi versus min b'she'enoi minoi. Like and like versus like in some other substance. What's the difference? According to Rabbi Yehuda, Atana, min b'minoi is never nullified. That's number one. Number two, de facto, the case of the Mishnah is min b'she'enoi minoi. Flour is one type, kavlin, melach, and mayim is another type. So let's understand when Rav Abba wanted to say his point, he could have just said, Dina Yisura Bitul, Dina Mamoinu Bit. He didn't say that. Not only he didn't say that, but Rav Abba's example already shows that he knew there's a problem with what he's saying. Because why didn't Rav Abba give an example of my wheat in your barley, my 1 kav of wheat that fell into 10 kav of your barley? That would have been a better analogy. Number one, L'kula alma by min b'she'enu minoi there's bittul beroiv when there's no tam, and it's similar to the case of the Mishnah. Why did he not say that? Let's read it inside. And like we just explained, it would have been a much better analogy. Because if he would have given the example of my wheat and your barley, the havale min b'she'enu minoi, umin b'she'enu minoi, batel, and therefore, let me just say, he knew that if it's taka min b'she'enu minoi, even when it comes to our topic, dina de mamayna, there is bittul. I want to give you a great example. I want to explain what I mean by bittul. This is a good example. We learned Chevra in the Bavas. If you have a person, God forbid, that's a gazlan, stole, and he made a shinui in the item that he stole. Do you remember what the halacha is? Who owns it? Who owns it?
The Ganav.
The Ganav. Now, I'm not saying that the Ganav doesn't have to compensate. Of course he has to compensate. Let me go back to my case. I have 10 kav of so'odim. Your kav of chitim fell into my grain. You know what the din is? He's saying it's taka batel. Batel means that the owner of the so'odim eats all of it. He has to compensate. But even though he has to compensate, you can't take it out. If you have grains that you can't, if it's discernible, then it's never batel. We're speaking about a case, something of yours fell into something of mine, and we cannot discern. Yes, he's saying there is bittul. Even by dinner bittul means not that I don't owe you the money. I owe you the money, but I'm the owner. If we don't know how to separate it out, then it's bittul. And coming back over here, that's still the question, that it should be bittul. We're not saying that the woman who made the flour, made the bread, doesn't have to give back tomorrow what she bought. Of course she does. She has to compensate for it, but it's now batel. And that's why Rav Abba did not give that example.
Rabbi,
let me just finish reading. So chitin bechitin nami knows the fact that you did not give an example of chitin b'se'odim, which is more analogous, is because you know that even by din of the mamayna there is bittul for ownership, not for financial owing the money, but for ownership. So even by chitin bechitin. True, according to the one Tana, which is Rabbi Yehuda, who holds min b'mino is not batel, loy batel, but we don't pass like Rabbi Yehuda. L'Rabbanan miftal batel. Yes, Danny.
Isn't it more likely to be made batel if it's min b'mino rather than min she'ena b'mino?
So there's the classic, not classical. There's the classic machlokes rishonim explaining why min b'mino l'Rabbi Yehuda is not batel. Bittul, let's go with one approach. Bittul means that there are two things that are struggling against each other. So one has to overwhelm the other. If they are like and like, they're working with each other. Let's think about tam. Let me go to the case of tam. So if you have 60 against one, the taste of the one is not discernible. If that tastes the same, it's still discernible. But it's not negay for here. The point is that the fact that you did not give the correct analogy, chitim b'so'edim, means you know yourself that even by dinah de mamoinam, as far as ownership is concerned, that's a great example of the gazlan. The gazlan owes the money, but he's the owner. So now that the ownership is from the flour owner, so it should be bound to their tchum. Okay. That so explains Rabbi Oishia against Rabab. So Amalei Rab Safra now is going to defend Rabab. Rab Safra is going to challenge Rabbi Oishia by giving him respect. First of all, Rabbi Oishia, he calls him Moshe. Moshe is what you call the greatest person. He says, Moshe, you're Moshe, but Shaper Ka'amrat, du sagst good. No, you're not saying good. V'loi shamia lohu, did you not hear how the Amar Abchia katois fa in the name of Rav? Quoting Rav, that what? Look at this. Look at these examples. Chevra, we can spend a year on this on it. If you remember in Bava Basra, we learned that by produce there was a certain small percent of acceptable waste product in that which I sell you. So if I'm selling you grains, there's a certain percent of pebbles and of straw that is acceptable to be mixed into the grain. So if I sold you a pound, you cannot in the pound, there was a little bit of pebbles. No, up until the percent of acceptable amount of waste. If it's there naturally, no one is allowed to add it. If it's there naturally, it's fine. So listen to this case, Nudnik. I have a field and I have a pile of wheat, and my neighbor decided on his own to take out all the pebbles. I never asked him to do that. No, that's going to cause me financial loss, because now that he took out, let's say the percent is 2%. I forgot the percent, so 4%. Let's say you took out the 2% of pebbles. You're not allowed to add pebbles. Even the grower, it's only if it's there naturally, it's accepted. Once he took out those pebbles, now for me to sell the same amount of grain, I have to add more grain. So is the pebble remover chayiv to compensate me? Says is said in the name of Rav, chayiv l'shalom noy d'mei chitim. Yes, that the nudnik, the person who took out the pebbles, who purified the wheat of the seller, has to compensate him. Now, guys, pebbles are worthless. They don't have value. Yet, what do we see? Even though he took out pebbles, since kilo means measurement, kilo chasrei, since he diminishes his measure, he's chayiv to compensate. Hachinami, so defends Rab Safra to Rab Abba, since even things, no, it's even by pebbles that are inherently negligible, right? They retain their chashivos, they retain their status as property of the original owner, and he has to compensate for the amount of wheat that you needed to put back in the place of the pebbles. So for sure, by the salt, in other words, the point is that it's not batel. Even something that is inherently worthless is not batel when it comes to dinah d'mamayna. If it caused a loss, then it's not batel. So here also, for sure, items that are not inherently negligible, which is exactly what you needed, the salt and the pepper. So if you were to remove it from the dough, there would be less dough, right? So now that you have it in the dough, there's more dough. So it remains something that belongs to its owner. Mamanis is never button from the pebbles. Kilo chasrei. Imagine I'm making flour, I borrowed salt, and you would remove the salt. No, the salt has chashivus here. Something that has financial value never is button. There's no bittul by money, by dinah d'mamayna. So argues Rab Safra. So now we're going to have a conversation, not between Abu Oisha and Rab Safra, but between Abaye and Rab Safra. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye tells Rab Safra, your analogy is not good, because did you not hear the difference between mamoin sheyesh le'tovim, between a financial loss, that there was someone that's demanding compensation. In the case where I own wheat and it was filled with pebbles, and you, without me asking you, you removed the pebbles. Who asked you to do that? You're causing me to have to add more wheat. You diminished my measure. I know by taking out something worthless, but and I'm going to ask from compensation. Something that there was someone demanding compensation, that's taken never bottle. However, didn't you hear? But there's a difference. Don't forget over here, in the case of our Mishnah, when the neighbor lent to me salt, the lender will never ask for that salt back. I know the lender only loaned it. They want an equivalent amount of salt or of pepper or of water. But that which was given to me, no one is going to demand for it back. So if I gave you something and I will never demand for the thing that I gave you back, that should be bottled. It makes sense. Should be bottled. So we're back to the question. Or this defends why the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael laughed at the answer of Rabbi Abba. So Amarlei or L'Taimei, if you will accept such a differentiation, if you're going to say that bittul depends whether there is toivim or not, that cannot be correct. Because the Amar Rab Chizda, when Rab Chizda came to explain the shita of Rebbe Yehuda. Now let's go back a little bit and review dinim regarding min deminoi. Like Rabbi Yehuda holds, min deminoi, like in like, is never nullified. Now let me ask you a question. How do you define like and like? Let me speak out the question. Meat and meat, one is kosher, one is nevela. Begashmias, it's meat and meat. Meat and meat. But halachically, this is kosher, this is nevela. Is that min b'minoi or not? So Rab Chizda said, oh, that's a good question. Not so simple. And it depends whether the minority that's being potentially nullified in the mivatel is the majority. It depends if they could become halachically alike, and he gives a beautiful scenario. Nevela, if nevela that's in the minority falls into the majority of shchuta can never become nevela. Shchuta halachically, shchuta doesn't give off tumah. Nevela gives off tumah. Shchuta will never give off tumas nevela. So even though it's meat and meat, Rabbi Yehuda will agree it's called min b'she'enoi minoi. Why is it min b'she'enoi minoi? Because the majority, the mivatel, halachically can never be like that which is potentially going to become nullified, and that's why it nullifies it. And therefore, just to know the halach, I know we're not speaking about money, but listen to this. Point will be, is that none of it will give off tumah. It's batal. But says Rab Chizda, Bishitas Rab Yehuda, that if there is a minority of meat that's slaughtered, that's not tamei, and it falls into a majority of nevela, according to Rab Yehuda, this is min b'minoi. How is it min b'minoi? I mean, it's not enough for it to be bagashmi is the same. It also has to share the same halachic status, because the majority, the mevatel, could lose its power to give off tumah. Anytime meat is no longer edible, not like by Pesach, not even for a dog. If it's not edible for people, it loses its status of nevela. Shchuta eina betela b'nevela. Why? Lefisha efsher l'nevela shetayasa shchut. So first of all, that's a fact. Now points out Rab Safra to Abaye, hachinami, if you will differentiate between toivim or not toivim by arguing that only something that has toivim is not batal, something that does not have toivim should become nullified. Hachinami dichi islei ba'olim loy batla. Are you going to tell me that when you're telling me that nevela could become batal, even like Rabbi Yehuda, if the majority is shchuta, right? Because shchuta can never become nevela. So are you going to tell me that the bittul only happens if someone is going to demand that nevela? In other words, where do we find in other areas, not of money, but where do we find that toivim or not toivim will affect the rules of bittul or not? It makes no difference. And if it makes no difference by dinah the Yisura, why would it make a difference over here? And if you're going to say anachanami, maybe. No, it's not true, because here I have it clear. For Hatanya Rabbi Yechon Menuri holds cheftzei hefker koinen shvisa. Now cheftzei hefker is something that we'll learn about on the next daf. There's a machlekes tanoim. How do you view an item that was ownerless when Shabbos or Yom Tov came in? Rabbi Yechon and Menuri holds that cheftzei hefker developed their own tchum. That means you have to know where was this item when Shabbos or Yom Tov came in. You measure the tchum from where the item is. If it was out there in the field, it's only 2,000 amas from either direction. If it was in a city, it's 2,000 amas beyond the ibura of that city. But the cheftzei hefker, they retain their own tchum. Okay. Afal pi she'ein loy ba'alim, even though it's still hefker, nevertheless, doimin kemi sheyesh lehem ba'alim. In other words, something without owners is still chashiv. V'haraya, it's chashiv for it to establish its own tchum. And coming all the way back over here, it's lack of ownership. Lack of ownership does not deprive an object of the quality of an ownership when it comes to a tchum. So even though the salt and the pepper, you can argue lacks ownership because they're not going to demand for it back, but it still should have its own tchum. So Abaye's differentiation, ein loy toivim, is refuted. Still, Abaye is insisting, Amar lohu, Amar lei. Abaye questions further that still, mi komedamis isura l'mamoina. Tchum is dine isura. And there's a difference between the dinim of tchumim and the dinim of ownership. By isura, batil. Memoina, loy batil. In other words, Abaye's final
Wasn't that the
argument,
original point?
No. The opposite. This is refuting the answer of Rav Abba. No, Abaye is going against Rav Abba over here. Abaye is saying that I agree that when it comes to money might not be as nullified as Dine Isura. That's fine. Tchumen is a Dine Isura. So the dinim of Tchumen should be nullified. That's a gewaldige point. In other words, the answer of Rab Abba to Chachmei Eretz Yisrael was, there's a difference between money and Yisurim. And by money, there's no bittul. You know what? Let's say there's no bittul. There's no bittul. So what? Don't forget, guys, the salt, just to make it clear, the case of the Mishnah is the items that are in the bread, those items don't have to be returned. Its value has to be returned. Its value is never nullified. Its value is not nullified even if there are no toivim. We know that, accept it. Still, the din of tchum is a din de isura. And therefore, the question still stands that as far as tchumen is concerned, how much is in this bread that belongs or belonged to someone else? A small amount. There should be bittul for the tchumen. That's a great question. No, it's yes, Danny, we are accepting that there is a difference between Isura and there is a difference. But the reason why they laughed at him is that they knew that. But they don't link together the din of the Mamoina and the din of the Isura. They don't hold it, goes together. Even though one comes from the other, but they don't have to remain bound the whole time. This is great. So as far as Tchumen is concerned, they asked a question. They couldn't understand. And they rejected his answer. What belongs to the neighbor here? A little bit of salt. So what? So what? It should be bottle. It is bottle. So the Dine Isura, the Tchuma should be bottle. And why does the Mishnah say that loaf of bread can only be taken to an area that's common to both of them? Now that we rejected Rababa's answer, the Gemara is going to give three answers. So answer number one. Abaye Omar, Abaye is the one that's constantly pushing back. Abaye is defending here the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael. Number one, that you're right. In the case of the Mishnah, it should be batel, 100%. But if they would allow it to be batel in the case of the Mishnah, people from the lack of knowledge will confuse it when someone is making a dough in partnership, which is not the case of the Mishnah. And by the way, partnership, Danny, doesn't mean that it's 50-50. What happens if I provide for 10% of the ingredients, also batel, but I own 10%? There, no one says that there should be bittul because I own it. I own part of it. So since in the case where there's a shutvis, kula alma moed, that's what the Mishnah says, the item can only be taken to an area that's common to both. So even in the case where there was a loan means that the neighbor is not a partner. The neighbor gave the pepper. The neighbor has no ownership. The person who made the dough owes the value or the equivalent amount of the pepper. Seder. But we might confuse one case with the other, and therefore the Chacham made a gzeira that even in the case of when you lent or gifted, when you gave the ingredients, that since you had it in the beginning of Yontiv, it belonged to the neighbor, it's bound to her tchum as well. Rava Amar, and as the Rishonim speak out, Rava doesn't argue with Abaye. Rava adds to it. And many people think about this. The whole question is not a question. At least by the water, yes, but not by the spices. Remember the dinim of bittul? Atavlin. Spices are never bottled. Spices is letame yavidi. It's made for taste. If you would put so little spices in something that large that the taste of the spice would be nullified, then why did you put the spices in there? Spices is made for taste. You dafka put enough spice. It could be quantitatively, it's a small amount. But qualitatively, it's not bottle. The tamele bottle, so spices are not bottle. Gavaldik. And once we speak about dinei bittul in general, daflametes, Rav Ashi gives the final answer, and each one agrees with the other. Rav Ashi says, the whole din of bittul, we had this in this Masech in the beginning, Daf Gimel, is only when by davar she'ein loy matir. In other words, if there's an item that's going to become permitted even without using bittul, we don't apply bittul. Tchumen doesn't mean you can't eat it. Tchum means that today on Shabbos, today on Yom Tov, you can't take it beyond a certain place. So what? And even if the eater is beyond that place, he can eat it tomorrow. Rav Ashi Yomar, wow, what a gevaldik daf. We're going to stop over here. You know what? Let's go a little bit further. Why? Because water, the way we worded it, since it becomes completely absorbed in the dough. Now, what mela spices have a color? What about salt? That will be the issue. Remember? Okay, so that he says that the owner of the water has no effect on the tchum. Mayimin, but melach loy. Hold on. Before we're going to question the logic of it, there is a stira. Rabbi Yehuda says mayim umelach betelim. And another detail, bein beisa, bein bekdeira. So the Gemara says leikasha, ha, meaning the Braisa that holds that even salt is nullified to the point where the owner of the salt has no effect on the tchum. That's only b'melach sedoimis. Melach sedoimis, my friend, is a very fine salt like our salt, that when you mix it into food, it completely gets dissolved. It's not discernible. Then Rabbi Yehuda is saying basically what Chachmei Eretz Yisrael were asking. Then it has no effect on the tchum. Our Mishnah is speaking about the melech isteroikonis, that's some sort of coarse salt, which is the granules are bigger. Even after you make the product, you can see it. That's why it's not bottle, and the ownership of Ben Hashmoshes will affect the tchum. V'hatanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now, v'hatanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer. I just want to make there's a little intro you have to chap that Rashi gives. That even though our Mishnah only spoke about making the dough, now that we quoted the Braisa speaking about people making a pot, the premise of the next question is based on the fact that l'cha'ura our Mishnah is also speaking about a pot, even though the Mishnah never mentioned the pot. The Braisa mentions about a pot of cooked food. So Rabbi Yehuda's statement is both by the dough and by the pot. That's the premise in the Mishnah. If not, the Mishnah would have differentiated. We learned in a Braisa that Rabbi Yehuda does differentiate. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mayim u'melech b'telam be'isa, but the eine b'telam b'kteira, not Mayim nor melech. Oy gewalt. And our Mishnah seemingly implies, even though the Mishnah never mentioned Kedera, that it is bottle. And why is it not bottle in the pot? So the Braisa explains, Mipnei roitva, because the soup or because the gravy remains discernible. You can see the water, you can see the juices. So is it bottle or not? And indeed, like Kasha, that our Mishnah is when it's a very thick pot. In other words, you can't see the juices. It's about, do you reckon, is it noticeable? If it's not noticeable, let Rabbi Yehuda, it's completely insignificant as far as Tchumen is concerned. The Braisa that's saying that B'Kedera, it's not bottle, that's Biraka, it's a soup, or it's something that's very liquidy. Even after it's ready, you see the juices. If you can see the juiciness in it, then the water is not bottle. Oh, we'll stop over here by the Mishnah. And we are heading towards the Siyum of Beitzah. So I want to say like this, Chabra, I have a wedding that I have to go to. I'm going to miss one morning. I'm going to miss 2 mornings. My flight leaves 6 o'clock. What I would like to do is like this, if everyone is okay, is I want to learn tonight both daf, lamed tesef, because mem is really only an amid. And we covered the hard. What we learned today, lamed ches, oh wow, that's a bomb amid. With bittul by money, these are big principles that you never thought about before. Maybe right after Maidav is over 7, maybe 7:30. I don't think it's going to take more than an hour and a half to learn 2 daf. But that's only for tomorrow. Then we'll put it up online tomorrow morning. Thursday morning, we're going to start Masechta Rosh Hashanah. The normal time. I'm going to be in Cleveland somewhere. But we're going to start it at 6 a.m. LA time. It was the only morning that I'll miss is tomorrow morning, and we'll learn that tonight. Is everyone okay with that? I want to get 1 daf ahead because Chabad.org, we're only 3 daf ahead of the daf hayomi. And over Shabbos, the people that learn over there, I'm getting text that they're behind.
Rav, can we get an exact time?
You want to do it at 7:30?
1 second. The 7:30 tonight work or 8 o'clock? What works better for the island?
7:30 is great.
7:30 is great. People have younger kids. Are we good 7:30 or that's a good? Learning. Okay. Danny, you good? So we're gonna we're gonna learn tonight. We'll put up on the YouTube. We'll put up over here tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock.
Rabbi, quick question.
Yes.
Why don't we say with the salt the same thing that Rava said, the tavla taimei avidtei? Why would you say that with salt also? Isn't it also flavoring the food for sure?
Who says he doesn't say it?
I'm saying so. The whole question was why does salt? It had
Rava's
salt
answer
versus fine salt. Even fine salt, you'd say it flavors it. So why should it be bottled?
You're confusing Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama. The Tanakama generally does not subscribe to bittul at all. Rabbi Yehuda subscribes to bittul. So there's something about discernible to Rabbi Yehuda that makes it if it's not even discernible, then it's non-existent. If it's you're mixing up Rabbi Yehuda with Rava. Rava's explaining the Tanakama.
Okay.
All right, Chevra, to be continued.